Happy Monday, April 21st. Today we're going to be talking about Leviticus 21. Hopefully everybody had a good Easter. Hopefully everybody is recovering after all the food, all the time with family, and then probably going back to work the next day. So I hope everybody's had a good day. But Leviticus 21 talks about the laws concerning priests. Priests had a higher standard than the rest of the camp. So they could not mourn their dead unless it was a super close family member, mother, father, son, daughter, brother, or virgin sister, because virgin sisters didn't have a husband to look after them. They could not make themselves unclean unless it was their closest relatives. What they would do is kind of rip their clothes, cover themselves with ash. They might cut their hair, but priests were not allowed to shave the edges of their beards off, make cuts on their body, put bald patches on their heads, because some of that was pagan. So the Israelites shouldn't have been doing it either, but the priests definitely shouldn't. So the kids also had a high standard. Priests could only marry, they couldn't marry a prostitute for sure, and they couldn't marry a woman who had been divorced. So for most priests, if a woman's husband had died, they could marry her. But if you were the high priest, you could only marry someone who was a virgin, who hadn't been married. So the higher you go, the higher the standards are, kind of thing. If your kids profane themselves, then the standard for that was higher too. You wouldn't get stoned; they would get burned to death with fire. Really, really a worse way to go than being stoned. But the higher you go, the higher the standard, the higher the cost. The New Testament has a similar principle where the teachers are judged more harshly. So the high priest definitely could not mourn anyone. He couldn't make himself unclean near bodies, even among his family members, not even his mother or his father, because God had set him apart. God had made him holy, the most holy that they could get. He couldn't let the hair hang loose. He couldn't rip his clothes, because the priestly clothes, weren't made by him. They were made for priestly service, set apart also by God. And again, they could only marry someone who had been a virgin. The high priest could only marry a virgin. The other priest could marry a widow. But finally, we get to who could serve as a priest. You had to be in the lineage of Aaron and of the Levites, but you had to be pure, spotless, unblemished, like the sacrifices. A lot of these blemishes that we're going to talk about are similar, kind of similar to what an animal, maybe, but a lot of these things would hinder your ability to serve as a priest. If you were a dwarf, if you couldn't see, if you had an itching disease, you had an injured hand or foot, you had to be just as pure and unblemished as the sacrifices. So if you had any of these issues, you couldn't serve as a priest. If you had crushed testicles, you couldn't serve as a priest. No one of the offspring of Aaron who had a blemish could offer sacrifices, since he had a blemish. He also couldn't enter the veil. They were allowed to eat the bread, eat the food that was sacrificed, but they couldn't serve as a priest. So maybe those people had jobs like taking the goat to the wilderness, taking the innards and stuff like that to burn. Maybe that was who did that. But they couldn't serve as a priest as far as offering sacrifices, going into the tabernacle, things like that. As far as the crushed testicles, I don't really know why. Maybe because I don't know, I'm assuming if your testicles are crushed, you're not going to be able to carry on a lineage. So the lineage that was carried on from generation to generation among the priests was supposed to be pure. So if they're crushed, you can't have kids, and therefore you can't continue the lineage. And either way, it's a blemish, and it's one that no guy wants. So God sanctified them. They were expected to be holy. They were expected to be unblemished. But being a priest was definitely something of honor. You were the one that offered the sacrifices. Offered, as it said several times, the food of God. You offered the food of God, I think is how it goes. Yeah. You were the one that had the food for God. So that was definitely an honor. And, with great power comes great responsibility. Thankfully today, and part of this could have been because this all points to Jesus, the pure, spotless Lamb who was sacrificed for us, who was unblemished, but not really known for his looks, for his strength, for feats. And to continue the lineage of the priests to the high priest, Jesus, would have been one of importance to keep that line pure. So yeah, that's all I got for today. And tomorrow we're going over Leviticus 22. Have a good day.